All right, Job chapter 11, let's call this one chipping away through redundancy. And even though we have looked at that term redundancy from the positive perspective, meaning that healthy organizations sometimes will duplicate skill sets so that if one person goes down, it's that old principle of next person up, so that you do not compromise the entire organization based upon the skill set of a single individual that can fulfill a role. This, however, is a case in which redundancy is not healthy, since Zophar, Job's third friend to speak, is basically going to repeat some of the same old criticisms that Job has already heard from his first two friends. Beginning right off the bat in verses 1 and 2, where it reads, "Then Zophar the Naamathite answered and said, should a multitude of words go unanswered, and a man full of talk be judged right?" That's super similar to what Bildad said in the very beginning, as we mentioned in chapter 8, verses 1 and 2. "Then Bildad the Shuhite answered and said, how long will you say these things, and the words of your mouth be a great wind?" Zophar is not very original, and it's going to continue on from there, because by the time we get to verse 7, he's going to say, "Can you find out the deep things of God?" which is really similar to something that Job himself acknowledged in chapter 9, verse 10, when he simply acknowledges that God does great things beyond searching out, when he's answering Bildad and saying, "How can I contend with the God who has wisdom that I cannot reach?" Once again, Zophar lacks originality, because in going on through verse 12, he is essentially going to repeat the same approach that Eliphaz had in lobbing lofty praise onto God while lobbing false accusations onto Job, understanding that you cannot praise God through dishonesty, something that Job is going to pick up on in the portion of his response that is in chapter 13. But before that, the redundancy is going to continue in verse 11, where Zophar is going to say, "For he knows worthless men. When he sees iniquity, will he not consider it?" Well, I think Bildad has already beat that point to a pulp, where he is going to say, picking up on his point about papyrus and reeds needing the right environment to grow, he's going to make the point by saying in verse 12, "While yet in flower and not cut down, they wither before any other plant. Such are the paths of all who forget God," as he goes on to talk about the ways in which God will not overlook what Zophar is essentially repeating in verse 11, and that's the deeds of worthless men and acts of iniquity. And from verse 13 all the way down to about the end of the chapter in verse 20, he is essentially going to be redundant and repeating the same approach that Job's first two friends used in concluding their statements, and that is, "Job, if you turn it around, God will be nice to you," even though none of them has identified anything in particular that Job has done wrong. Zophar, however, has two unique criticisms of Job, one in verse 6, where he says, "God exacts less of you than your guilt deserves." It's pretty pointed, and it's actually original. And in verse 20, he's also going to have the unique take on this situation where he says, "But the eyes of the wicked will fail. All way of escape will be lost to them, and their hope is to breathe their last." Kind of taking a shot at Job's repeated request to die, as if only the wicked fall into the level of despair that actually prefers death to lingering in a miserable condition. Understanding that that's just false. We've already identified that Elijah and Moses, and even moving forward, Paul, were some of God's strongest or seemingly strongest servants who reached a certain level of persecution that had them preferring death to continuing on in their miserable condition. So there's no shame in where Job is in wanting to die, understanding that he is in uncharted territory for any of them. And they are forgetting that they have never been where Job is, and so they can't necessarily understand why he's gotten to the point where he prefers death to life. And even though we cannot necessarily fault either Zophar or Eliphaz for having a limited experience, God is ultimately going to hold them accountable for passing judgment on Job based upon their limited experience. And so maybe even more than Eliphaz, Zophar's pointed condemnation of Job seems to be made worse by the fact that most of what he says is simply redundant, reminding me of some advice that a group of us got before presuming to take a microphone or any kind of platform, really. And that advice was simply, look, if you're going to grab a platform, make sure you got something to say. And that seems to be the mistake that Zophar makes here. Stepping up third, it can sometimes be hard to be original. So my prayer for you is my prayer for me. To the degree we're trying to decide whether we're speaking first, third, or whether or not we're going to open our mouths to speak at all, may God give us the wisdom to understand whether or not we really have something to say.